What do I mean by a floating signifier? Well, to put it crudely, race is one of those major concepts which organize the great classificatory systems of difference which operate in human societies. And to say that race is a discursive category recognizes that all attempts to ground this concept scientifically, to locate differences between the races on what one might call scientific, biological, or genetic grounds, have been largely shown to be untenable. We must therefore, it said, substitute a socio-historical or cultural definition of race for the biological one. I don't want to deviate here with a long theoretical disquisition about the terms that I'm using, which would bore you to tears. I simply want to remind you that the model being proposed here is closer to that of how a language works than of how our biologies or our physiologies work. That race is more like a language than it is like the way in which we are biologically constituted. You may think that's an absurd and ridiculous thing to say. You may even now be surreptitiously glancing around the room just to make sure that your visual appearances are in full working order. I assure you they are. People do look rather peculiar. Some of them are brown, some of them are quite black. Some of you are pretty brown, some of you are really disgustingly pink in the current light. But there's nothing wrong with your appearances, but I want to insist to you that nevertheless, the argument I want to make to you is that race works like a language. And signifiers refer to the systems and concepts of the classification of a culture, to its making meaning practices. And those things gain their meaning not because of what they contain in their essence, but in the shifting relations of difference which they establish with other concepts and ideas in a signifying field. Their meaning, because it is relational and not essential, can never be finally fixed, but is subject to the constant process of redefinition and appropriation, to the losing of old meanings and the appropriation and collection and contracting of new ones, to the endless process of being constantly re-signified, made to mean something different in different cultures, in different historical formations, at different moments of time. The meaning of a signifier can never be finally or transhistorically fixed. That is, it is always, or there is always, a certain sliding of meaning, always a margin not yet encapsulated in language and meaning, always something about race left unsaid, always someone, a constitutive outside, whose very existence the identity of race depends on, and which is absolutely destined to return from its expelled and abjected position outside the signifying field to trouble the dreams of those who are comfortable inside. I address this point directly because I believe this is exactly where the more skeptical amongst you may be beginning to think, all right, you might say perhaps race is not, after all, a matter of genetic factors, of biology, of physiological characteristics, of the morphology of the body, not a matter of color, hair, and bone, that chilling threesome that Du Bois frequently quotes. But you may say, can you seriously be claiming that it is simply a signifier, an empty sign, that it is not fixed in its inner nature, that it cannot be secured in its meaning, that it floats in a sea of relational differences? Is that the argument that you're advancing? And isn't it not only wrong, but a trivial, and I hear the word being rustled in the audience, an idealist approach? After skirting around through these various discursive structures, we've come to what, after all, we all know about race. It's reality. You can see its effects. You can see it in the faces of the people around you. You can see people pulling their skirts aside as people from another racial group come into the room. You can see the operation of racial discrimination in institutions and so on. What is the need of all this scholarly hullabaloo about race when you can just turn to its reality? There are probably differences of all sorts in the world. The difference is a kind of anomalous existence out there, a kind of random series of all sorts of things in what you call the world. There's no reason to deny this reality or this diversity. I think it's sometimes, not always, what Foucault means when he talks about the extra discursive, but I'm in Goldsmiths, I don't want to, to stir up the Foucauldians here. However, it's only when these differences have been organized within language, within discourse, within systems of meaning, that the differences can be said to acquire meaning and become a factor in human culture and regulate conduct. That is the nature of what I'm calling the discursive concept of race. Not that nothing exists of differences, but that what matters are the systems we use to make sense, to make human societies intelligible. The systems we bring to those differences, how we organize those differences into systems of meaning with which, as it were, we can find the world intelligible. And this has nothing to do with denying that, as I say, the audience test, if you looked around, you'd find we did, after all, look somewhat different from one another. I think these are discursive systems because the interplay between the representation of racial difference, the writing of power, and the production of knowledge is crucial to the way in which they're generated and the way in which they function. And I use the word discursive here to mark the transition, theoretically, from a more formal understanding of difference to an understanding of how ideas and knowledges of difference organize human practices between individuals.